Hey everybody, it's Friday, February 26th, and we're here for another edition of Nonprofit Executive Spotlight. I'm your host, Cecilia Supp. I'm a certified association executive, and I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Nonprofit Consulting and Association Management Services. Nonprofit Executive Spotlight is something that we do to help our colleagues in the nonprofit community who are seeking their next opportunity. And I am delighted today to have as this week's guest, Cathy Lada, who's a longtime colleague and friend of mine. And Cathy is here to talk a little bit about her views of the association world and what kind of a position she is looking for. Welcome, Cathy. Would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Cecilia, thanks for having me. Like you said, I've known you for a while, and until recently, though, I didn't know what the story was behind your name, Rogue Tulip. So if you're watching this and you haven't read her story, I'd definitely go to her website to read that. It's very interesting.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. The website is roguetulips.com if you're curious, audience.
There you go.
Thanks for the shout out, Cathy. Now, let's talk about you.
Okay, me. Sure. Well, I am first and foremost a nonprofit leader. I've been working in or on the board of nonprofits for about 20 years now, and most of that's been in communications and marketing, all of it pretty strategic, and then even more so in the last few years where I've gotten a lot more involved in organization strategy and things like that. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, that's wonderful. I know you're an enterprising association executive, and any team that you join will be improved and be happy that they found you and connected with you. What's your education background? I think people should know about your advanced degree.
Sure, yeah. I have a doctoral degree in communications and information systems. We studied things like knowledge management and user interface design and very technical things. But I actually had the opportunity in my dissertation to focus on the nonprofit world, and specifically I focused on social entrepreneurship. So I analyzed a lot of the Stanford Social Innovation Review about how to scale your social enterprise.
Oh, and that's so important for associations and nonprofits of other kinds today, the social enterprise model. That would be great to integrate into any group. So, what can you tell us a little bit about your philosophy when it comes to nonprofit management?
Yeah, and actually talking about being an enterprising nonprofit leader and social entrepreneurship, that's definitely one of my philosophies when it comes to being in the nonprofit sector, is looking at your revenue mix and making sure you have earned income in there. I think more associations are doing that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But then upstream thinking, systems thinking to get at root causes. Those are the two kind of core tenets, I guess, of my philosophy. So with the earned income, and that's what, social entrepreneurs do. They focus first and foremost on an issue, but then of course they have to be solvent. So they've, got various products to fund that. But I'm seeing that more and more with nonprofits as well. I actually worked with a fairly small church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I lived recently, in a project called the Oasis Project. It was the Community and Economic Development Division of that church. And you wouldn't necessarily think of churches as A, business like, B, enterprising, but they were. That's very much a great example of social entrepreneurship, and that's why I had found them in the first place with my students doing a field trip there. So the nonprofit group, the Oasis Project, has a transportation business, Oasis Transportation, because they saw a need in the community for busing students, high school students from home to the school, because the school district had closed down the transportation route. Everyday Cafe, which is a nonprofit cafe, Oasis Kitchen, which is a community commercial kitchen, a farm and fishery, a maintenance group. So they found, the core of all these things is they're a nonprofit who were meeting very specific needs in their communities, but doing it in a very financially sustainable way, which is really cool. I love to see nonprofits that can do that. You can only rely on government grants or corporate grants and things like that so much. You really need to sort of, take the reins there.
Well, and that sounds like a complex organization that you became familiar with, and again, bringing all of those things together. So what does that tell you, that micro experience, what does that tell you about the big trends that you see?
Yeah, so one of the biggest trends definitely is systems thinking, upstream thinking. Now that's systems thinking. I hate it because that's become such a buzzword, but truly, but it really is gaining more and more traction, I think, as I see smaller and smaller nonprofits actually looking out to see how they can impact the ecosystem in which they work. They're kind of shifting from this being reactive mode to engaging in advocacy and working with coalitions, creating coalitions if necessary, so that all the workload isn't on their staff for their nonprofit. Just advocating for policies they can work together. They're always, I think, what I see with those nonprofits is they're kind of always asking two questions relentlessly. What do we really want to create an impact? What exists today? So how do we do that? A good example that I came across during my doctoral studies was Share Our Strength. Also Kaboom, they provide direct services. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with both of those organizations, but about, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, they shifted to more of a systems focus, and they started directly addressing policies that affected, in both of their cases, childhood obesity and other social issues. And what was interesting was that they exponentially increased the buy-in of their board, their volunteers, their funding. They elevated their brands, and they're making systems change so that they're no longer fixing a symptom, they're fixing the problem.
Oh, and I love that. Don't just look at symptoms, solve what's causing the symptoms. And I think that's so important. People overlook that. People talk a lot about strategy development, but what is your goal, and what is the question you're answering or the problem you're trying to solve? And I think that's great you brought that up. So I have a couple other questions for you, but I have another one before we get to the next two. We described you as an enterprising nonprofit executive. So if somebody asked you, Cathy, what does that mean? How are you enterprising? What would your response be?
So when I think of an enterprising or even entrepreneurial nonprofit leader, I think that you really focus on the market. And in this case, it's your members and your stakeholders in a broader sense as well, and looking at what they need and connecting back the nonprofit, and in my case, marketing back to that need. Marketing and communications have to be at the table, I think, when you are developing new products and programs right from the start. There's this thing called the voice of the customer, which is another one of those buzzwords, but essentially it just means listening to your members and listening to what's going on in the stakeholder arena surrounding your customers, their members, their customers. So when I think of enterprising, I really truly think of it in a way as being nimble, responding to the environment, and responding to your members. Being a member first organization is really, really important.
Oh, yeah, definitely, because so many people seem to overlook that part of the organization sometimes because we get distracted by other things. And
chase the next shiny thing.
exactly, we're seeing that, we're chasing it, we're distracted, and it's been something of a disturbing trend, in my opinion, of when people were, organizations were responding to the pandemic last year, that membership departments were being eliminated.
Yeah.
At membership organizations. That I find that disturbing, and we'll leave it at that. We'll move on. So Cathy, what do you consider your 3 strengths?
When I think of my strengths, that's a good question. I think about storytelling and copywriting. I think of those 2 things together: integrating marketing and communications and systems thinking, and then leading teams. So kind of starting with the integrating marketing and communications, I have been in this field, like I said, about 20 years, and it's changed a lot in that time. The advent of social and all the different things that are going on now with the way that we get our information and our news. So, marketing sort of evolved from these silos of activity. So you had your social strategy, and then you had your direct mail strategy, and this and that. And I think most most associations today integrate their marketing and communications together, where you tell the same story, the same message, packaged in a different way for your different audiences in the channel that they prefer. So I might want to share a story about my my last association's cold carrier program, and I would share maybe a personal story from a member participating in that on a Facebook or even LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm really going to talk about the highlights of that program. So just my strength is being able to look at all of those things across the programs of the association. So we cross-sell, to use a term from from the business world, but also looking at the channels and messages that we use. Every touch point with the customer is an opportunity to reinforce or destroy your brand. So I think it's important to look at all of those things. So that would be one strength.
That's a broad strength too. That's great. That's a great one.
And copywriting and storytelling. So when I train or coach my employees, my staff, my communications team, I always start with the basics because we always forget them. You get in such a hurry, and I've done it too. For instance, I've written a blog post or a social media post and forgotten to put the date of the program in there. So I go back and read it and you catch it, but you just kind of forget the basics. So that's where I always start. What do I need to say? Who's my audience? What do they care about? Have some empathy and be in their shoes. What do they know about whatever it is you're trying to talk about already? What do I want them to do? What's the best channel to reach them, and how do I motivate them to take action? So those kind of 7 steps are the core, I think, of good copywriting and marketing. So when we combine that with storytelling, you really get marketing and communication that really engages your member more. There have been a lot of studies on neuroscience and business that show you that, more areas of your brain light up when you're sharing a story rather than sharing dry facts, and things like 70% of my members, think X. So I think being able to do that and break down the communications barriers by telling stories and making things personal is really, really important. So I've done that with just as simple as working with a member who was interviewed by one of the magazines in our industry, and she had no idea what to talk about or what to say about her own story. It was her career, featuring this woman in this industry of very few females. And so I actually sat down with her, and using my copywriting and storytelling sort of lenses, just, drew out the story and, what are you learning? What do you see as in the industry? And actually ghost wrote it for her. We got it published. So I think that's definitely a skill set of mine that I think is really important. And the stories give you a chance to discuss your strengths, your values, like inclusion and transparency, your focus on member needs, without actually saying, we're inclusive, we're transparent, we're member focused in every communication. You do want to have a vision and mission statement, certainly, with those values on your website. But if you're going to build those loyal tribes, going back to what Seth Godin introduced many years ago about your folks, maybe talk about a story that, how a member shaped a webinar and how that information came about and why it was such a need. That actually demonstrates that you're being inclusive because you're talking to the members, you're member focused, having them actually shape the program and all those kind of things. So you can tell those stories without actually just saying the words.
Well, and I think that's a great explanation, and you gave very specific examples that people can listen to, and they really can see that you understand what you're talking about and what you're doing. So we're almost at the end of our time. I'd like to ask you a closing question. Mm-hmm. What kind of a position are you looking for?
Yeah, so I am looking to stay in the DC area. First of all, that's where I am based. And I would like to stay with nonprofit, so mission driven, whether it's a nonprofit trade or professional association, foundation, social enterprise, B corporation. But I'm looking culturally that it's a learning organization. So not only just in marketing communications, but learning by doing and reflecting and collecting and sharing that institutional knowledge. someone that values professional development. I am studying for my CAE. I finally finished my 100 hours of, different credit hours for continuing ed and, agile marketing and principles of machine learning and, then the boring stuff to me, which is finance and accounting. I've used a lot of this time, that I've been out of the association world to focus really during this pandemic on my professional development. So, working in an association that values that and is going to support me in that is really, really important. And then just, the final thing is really an association that values having marketing engaged at the onset of product development and throughout product refinement. I've really developed an agile mindset when it comes to marketing and really look at, we have a plan and it's certainly shaped and informed by certain things, but you want to adapt over time and iterate fairly quickly with how you're presenting the information, what kind of product features that you have. So for instance, if you have an online community, changing up what features are available to your membership and all that kind of thing. I think that marketing and communication sometimes isn't even brought in during the conversation about creating new products and marketing, which to me is kind of interesting because one of the P's in the 4 P's of marketing is the product. But I think in the nonprofit world, I've seen that not in practice, that doesn't seem to happen as much as I would like. Or B, you get pulled in at the end when they say, hey, I'm ready to go to market. And you're like, okay, what is it that we're marketing? What are we going to do? So engaging us throughout the whole process. So I think that those things are really important, not only for me in an association, I think, but for all associations.
I think that's a wonderful summary. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I've known you for a number of years now, and I know that any organization that adds you to their team will be happy they did it. So if somebody wants to talk to you about a position, Cathy, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Probably my email, and you can find that on my website, which is cathylada.com.
Oh, excellent. You have your own website.
I do. I have been consulting during the pandemic, and I have been for a number of years, but that's really what has kept me interested kept me focused on nonprofits.
So that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us as a guest on Nonprofit Executive Spotlight. And again, everyone, if you want to talk to Cathy, cathylada.com, talk to her fast. She's a sought after candidate. So she may not be on the market much longer if you want to talk with her. So this great, wonderful interview. And if you'd like to know more about Rogue Tulips, as we mentioned at the beginning, you can find us at roguetulips.com. And we'd be happy to talk with you about whatever needs your organization has. So I want to thank Cathy Lada again for joining us. And we'll be back again with another episode unless everybody gets a job.
Thanks, Cecilia. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.